The Jeep brand and Jeep's parent company have rightly been accused of being a little bit late to the electrification party, but they're changing that big time. The Jeep Wrangler is now the best-selling plug-in hybrid in America, and likely later this year we're going to find out that the Grand Cherokee plug-in hybrid might be coming in at number 2, and any way you slice it, Jeep is selling more plug-in hybrid vehicles than any other brand in the United States. Even though hybrids have been on sale in the US for more than 20 years, there's still a bit of confusion. So let's talk about hybrids, plug-in hybrids, what they are and what they do first. A hybrid system allows the vehicle to have a smaller engine. So the smaller engine is more efficient, it's backed by the electric motor to give you the feeling of a bigger, more powerful engine with the fuel economy savings of a smaller engine. Then you also get the benefit of regenerative braking when you're slowing down to a stoplight or a stop sign or you're going downhill, and then you can then use that energy later. It also allows the vehicle to turn off the engine at stoplights, still run the air conditioning and other high-draw electrical loads from that battery pack on board. Regular hybrids, you don't plug in. You simply feed them gas, you drive down the road. If you have no ability to plug your vehicle in, you probably want a regular hybrid. If, on the other hand, you have the ability to plug a hybrid in, even on an infrequent basis, you might want a plug-in hybrid, and that's what Jeep's 4xe systems are. This is the same sort of hybrid concept, smaller engine, so we have a 2-liter engine under the hood, big electric motor, 134 horsepower, and then a big battery behind. This battery pack you charge at home. Once the battery pack is charged, you can then use that electricity to drive electric only, or the electricity can be used to augment the engine in situations where you need more power. So you're not limited to just the electric only ability of that electric motor, even when the battery is fully charged. Jeep's Grand Cherokee is unusual in the midsize SUV and crossover segment for a number of reasons. This is the only entry still designed for a V8 engine to live under the hood, outside of luxury SUVs, of course. But that's part of what's unusual about the Grand Cherokee. This is designed to compete not just with something like a Ford Explorer, if you'd rather have a 2-row option rather than the 3-row standard that we find in that model. This is also designed to compete with a BMW X5 or perhaps a Mercedes-Benz GLE in the upper end trims. And it does so pretty well with one of the best interiors ever crafted by an American manufacturer. It also is very off-road focused. Off-road ability in this vehicle is much closer to something like a Wrangler or a Bronco than a Ford Explorer or a BMW X5. This has available locking differentials, it has a 2-speed transfer case, and even the plug-in hybrid model gets a lot of those same features. So if you're looking for a blend of off-road ability, on-road ability, and luxury with a plug, you basically have this or a Range Rover. Moving to the rear, Jeep definitely went with a simple and elegant design theme for this generation. We have full LED tail lamp modules here. The tail lamp modules are connected with this shiny black strip right in the middle. The rear end is pretty dusty, but I decided not to dust it because theoretically Jeeps are supposed to get dusty, and that's certainly what happens when I drive vehicles here at home. Down at the bottom of the bumper, we have dual integrated exhaust tips. This center section covers the 2-inch hitch receiver, and all 4xe models are rated to tow 6,000 pounds. That is the second highest tow rating of any plug-in hybrid vehicle sold in North America. If you want to tow more than this and you want to plug, you're going to need an electric pickup truck, or you're going to need something like a Porsche Cayenne, which is certainly going to be more expensive than this. If you want an even deeper dive into Jeep's plug-in hybrid system, there's a link in the description where I take a look at a cutaway of the Grand Cherokee and I point out all the individual components and talk about how they work together. Because this is a plug-in hybrid system, the heart of it is a 4-cylinder gasoline engine. This is a 2-liter turbo. It produces 270 horsepower in its own right. The key thing to know about Jeep's plug-in hybrid system, whether we're talking about this in the Grand Cherokee or in the Wrangler, is that these are designed to operate very much like the regular drivetrains in the Grand Cherokee. We have exactly the same 8-speed automatic transmission, the same 2-speed transfer case, the same 4-wheel drive systems in the 4xe and in the regular models. There are just a few key differences, which is going to explain why they behave differently. The first thing is we have no torque converter here. Instead, we find the 2-liter 4-cylinder engine up front, and then we have a clutch pack, a pancake electric motor, and then the 8-speed automatic transmission. Connected to the 8-speed automatic transmission is that pancake motor. Again, it's 134 horsepower and a decent amount of torque. That's what powers the Grand Cherokee along in electric-only mode. So in EV mode, you have 134 horsepower max. When everything is working together, you have 375, making this the most powerful and swiftest Grand Cherokee 0 to 60, obviously excluding the previous model, which had more powerful engines available under the hood. Now, because this vehicle has no torque converter, low-speed starts and low-speed crawls are always going to be handled by that 134 horsepower electric motor. If you need more torque and more oomph, it has to close the clutch so it can connect the engine to the transmission and the engine can assist the vehicle going forward. So certain low-speed situations are not going to be as smooth as the regular Grand Cherokee, or as smooth as some competitive plug-in hybrid systems that have retained the torque converter. The reason Jeep deleted it is for space and efficiency. Obviously, the torque converter takes room. Some of that room is occupied by the electric motor, but also efficiency is lost a bit if you have that torque converter in the equation. To enable those low-speed crawl situations, even when the battery is completely depleted, we have a motor generator unit on the front of the 2-liter 4-cylinder engine. That's good for 44 horsepower. It can assist the engine up front, and it can also generate power, shuttle it to the battery, or to the electric motor whenever needed. Instead of the single battery pack that we find in the Wrangler 4xe, the Grand Cherokee uses a split pack. So there's one under the passenger seat in the front and one under the driver's seat. Together they give us 17.3 kilowatt hours, about 15.5 of that is usable. Unlike some plug-in hybrids out there, the 4xe system can heat and cool the battery, and it can heat and cool the cabin without involving the gasoline engine. So if you want to be absolutely electric only for up to 26 miles, this is going to be an excellent option. But the mission of the Grand Cherokee, as with other plug-in hybrids, is not about gasoline replacement. This is about gasoline mitigation. And if you do not have the ability to plug the vehicle in, it's not going to give you much of a benefit. But if you do have the ability to plug it in, even just at work or just at home, you are going to see a significant reduction in your gasoline consumption versus a regular Grand Cherokee. Here's how the last few days have calculated out. Over the last few days, I've driven 120 miles, just barely over. 110.6 of them were in EV mode, 9.6 in gasoline mode, and I consumed 0.4 of a gallon of gasoline to drive that 120 miles. That is exactly what the Grand Cherokee plug-in hybrid is about. And that's why, for me, this is actually a better fit than a lot of electric vehicles, because I live off-grid. If you didn't know that, then you can check out a video about my off-grid living. There's a separate video on that where I take a deeper dive into my reality. But I have difficulties plugging in an electric vehicle in the winter at home. There's just not enough electricity going around. So this kind of vehicle, I could plug it in every day in the summer, in the spring, and perhaps the fall, but come winter, I could drive it in gasoline-only mode if I needed to and absolutely not have a problem. That's a little bit trickier with the full electric vehicle, especially if you don't have the ability to charge it at the office or on one side of your daily commute. Now, where things get a little bit tricky in some reviews of the Grand Cherokee plug-in hybrid and the Wrangler is when we start talking about fuel economy, because Jeep calculates it pretty weirdly. Jeep and their parent company Stellantis, all of their vehicles sold in North America, they tend to calculate fuel economy by giving the electric consumption an MPGe rating and then smushing that into the gasoline consumption, resulting in that 120-mile trip giving us an indicated 47 MPG. The Jeep engineers argue that you have to factor in the cost of that electricity to your calculations somehow. But when you compare this plug-in hybrid to some plug-in hybrids that were previously sold in the US, most notably the Chevy Volt, you will get a very different number, because Chevy takes the gallons used and the miles driven and they would give you a ginormous fuel economy number. In that calculation, this would be 293 MPG, because 0.4 of a gallon, 120 miles, you get 293. But Jeep tries to give you an MPG number even when you are driving in electric-only mode. So last 23 miles electric-only in this vehicle, I've averaged about 53 MPG, even though no G was consumed for that driving. Now, what makes this number even weirder is the calculation when the Grand Cherokee is not plugged in at all. And that's where some outlets have gone a little bit wrong. If you drive this as a hybrid only, and then it regenerates power back into the battery, when the battery is then used to drive the vehicle forward in electric-only mode, again, starting with the battery flat, it's going to do that same MPGe calculation. Exactly why that is, I don't know, but this is one of the only plug-in hybrid vehicles that will calculate fuel economy in that manner. And that's really important, because when I drove this on a test loop to test its fuel economy, the indicated fuel economy on the instrument cluster was 19.8 MPG. But over that drive loop, which was a combination of city and highway driving, mostly level, the temperature outside was 90 degrees, so I was definitely using the air conditioning a lot, When I calculated it out, actually filled the vehicle back up, I got 24 MPG because of the way that Jeep is choosing to calculate that fuel economy. So if you're watching a review of a Grand Cherokee 4xe or a Wrangler 4xe and they're simply talking about indicated fuel economy, know that Jeep is for some reason selling themselves short. It's a very, very peculiar thing. I don't know why they're doing it. I don't know if they're going to issue a software update, but Jeep seems to be really committed to trying to calculate that electric consumption based on its MPGe rating. In that situation where this vehicle is operating as a hybrid, the battery has been depleted, it is completely fair to use your miles driven, your gasoline consumed, and calculated MPG number without trying to track the E somehow differently. That's an important thing to know about the Jeep plug-in hybrid system. The Grand Cherokee has long been known for having a comfortable and premium interior, except of course for one generation which was truly terrible. We'll talk about that a little bit later. This seat has a power extending thigh cushion, 4-way adjustable lumbar. We have a powered tilt telescopic steering column and front seat massage with 2-position memory for the driver and the front passenger. The front passenger seat has the exact same range of motion. It also has the 2-position memory and the massage functionality. Obviously, the passenger doesn't get a tilt telescopic steering column though. Jumping into the back, we find plenty of legroom, but not as much as you might find in some of the alternatives. Because this vehicle was designed for that large V8 engine, we have a long hood, so for the overall size of the Grand Cherokee, the interior does feel a little bit smaller, simply because of that reality. But I still have about 6 inches of legroom back here. This is easily the kind of vehicle where you could put rear-facing child seats, absolutely no problem in the back. And because this is a fairly wide mid-size vehicle, it's certainly going to have more width across the rear bench than something like a Jeep Cherokee or a RAV4. This is definitely in that next category up size-wise. And feature-wise, so we have things like 4-zone automatic climate control back here, rear heated seats, lots of USB ports. There are actually 4 USB charge-only ports back here, and then we have a 120-volt power port down there. Well-integrated manual side shades right here, and reclining rear seats, if I could get that back in the track. The rear seats have a pretty aggressive recline. You can get them really upright to square off that cargo area, or you can move them back about 7 inches. We have the panoramic moonroof in this model that is going to cut down on headroom in the rear. So if you're considering getting it or not, keep that in mind. But even in this seat's most upright position, I have about 1 inch of headroom left. So pretty generous thanks to the very boxy profile. You'll find the controls for the rear climate zones right there on that center console. And even though we have a hump for the drive shaft in the rear, because of the design of the Grand Cherokee, it actually is a little bit smaller than some of the crossover competition. Behind the power hatch, we find one of the largest cargo areas in this segment, and because the battery pack is located under the front seats, the cargo area does not change for the plug-in hybrid model, meaning that we have a nearly full-size spare tire back here. Spare tires are rare in hybrids and almost unheard of in plug-in hybrids, especially ones this big. Again, nearly full size. This is a 245/65 R18. It's worth noting that Ford would probably call this a full size because they do that in the Lightning. They say it has a full size spare and it's not the same size as the other tires in the vehicle. But 245, that's actually wider than the regular tires that we find on a decent number of hybrids and plug-in hybrids. The style of this interior might not be quite your cup of tea, but in terms of parts quality and build quality on the inside, this interior is definitely in keeping with similarly priced entries from Europe. We have the controls for the large panoramic moonroof up here, the telematics system, etc. This large panoramic moonroof is of course optional, but it goes to just about over the rear passengers' heads. Right now we're taking a look at an Overland trim. This is not the top end trim, but it is pretty close. So some of the things that we see in here are not going to be found in the base model. However, all versions are going to have height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger. This model has 4-way adjustable headrests. And I think one of the things that Jeep does a good job with is something that we also see from the Korean car companies. That is that they swap out a decent number of interior components as you work your way on up the trim ladder. So in this Overland trim, there are more soft touch materials and more premium materials around. And if you go even higher up the ladder, then we get even more premium materials. The front seats are going to be pretty similar in the top end Summit trim. You can see that we have leather upholstery here. It's a soft type leather with some contrasting stitching, perforations in the middle for that ventilation function. But if we move over to the front doors, we don't find quite as much soft touch material as you find in the very top end trim. The upper section of the door, those are made from stitched materials. We then have wood trim right there in the middle. This one has the optional Macintosh audio system, but we do find harder plastics just below this level on the dashboard and on the doors. So lower portion of the door, it's made from hard plastic, as this center section here is. But if you go on up to the next level, then you get soft touch stitched components down there that really dresses up the interior. The different components in the different trims are important to keep in mind, because if you've been to a Jeep dealer and you've hopped inside a Laredo and then you read a review online posted about how great the Grand Cherokee's interior is, you might think that we're all crazy, because that Laredo is going to have a rubbery dashboard, more hard plastics. The dashboard section here is going to be a little bit different because it won't have this passenger LCD screen, which you can turn on with that button right there. You can barely see it. It has a prism in it, so that way the driver cannot view that screen from the driver's angle right like that. It's also going to have a smaller screen right here in the center console. It's not going to have the same kind of features. It's not going to have the wood trim. It's going to have rubbery plastic here and there, more hard plastic, etc. So definitely keep that in mind. When we're talking about this vehicle being really up there with the luxury entries, we're talking about this specific one, not the base trim. That base trim is designed to compete with entries like a Ford Explorer. Down here we have physical controls for the infotainment system, toggles for the climate control right there, buttons for the heated seat and ventilation system. There's a black plastic lid. I do not like the amount of black plastic we find in here. I think it is a bit much. I'm also worried it might scratch over time, especially this section right here. Black plastic tends to get scratched up with fingers a little bit. We have 4 USB inputs. All 4 work with the infotainment system, although obviously one at a time, so plenty of options there. We then have a rotary shifter here. This is the toggle mode for the air suspension in the vehicle. Drive mode selector right over here. For low selector, this model does not have a locking rear differential. And then over here we have the hill descent control. Behind the shifter knob, we find another piece of black plastic. I really wish that upgraded versions of the Grand Cherokee would go for wood here, because that would show scratches a little bit less. Here we have 2 large cup holders, a padded center console lid with a reasonable amount of storage space. There's a first tier, and then there's a second tier right down there. Because the transmission is placed fairly low in the vehicle, we do have a reasonable amount of storage in this area of the center console, but not a lot going on there because that bell housing is up there towards the firewall. This model has a full color heads-up display, so we have a hole in the dashboard right there. The dashboard is a stitched leather component. And on the driver's side, we have a large full color LCD. Here you can see what I was talking about earlier with the way that this vehicle calculates fuel economy. This is an all-electric drive. 0 time was spent with the gasoline engine on. It still says 55 MPG, go figure. This display is quite configurable. There's tons of different layouts and displays here. You can get a tachometer if you want, audio information, vehicle messages, lots of settings. There's a night vision system that you can go ahead and start. I'm not sure how useful night vision is, but hey, it's a pretty cool feature. There are also some auxiliary gauges, and you can go for this sort of tableau layout where you can pop things up and then rotate through several different options on each of these individual little panels. And of course, if you want a moving map display, that's available as well. Now, moving out from there, we find a new steering wheel. This is similar to the one that we find in the Jeep Wagoneer and Grand Wagoneer. We have wood trim down here at the bottom, black plastic insert right around there. You'll find paddle shifters on the back of the steering wheel along with infotainment buttons on the back. So track up, down over here on the left, volume up, down over here on the back side of the right side of the steering wheel, which is why the paddles are these sort of partial paddles just on top. Going back to the front, you'll find the controls for the radar adaptive cruise control system on the right side of the wheel, and then the controls for that instrument cluster over here on the left, along with phone hang-up and pickup buttons. This little button is how we toggle on and off that tableau view. Now let's talk about how we control the hybrid system. On the left side of the steering column, we have 3 buttons: hybrid, electric, and e-save. Hybrid's pretty self-explanatory. It will mix the power sources however it feels is best. Electric prioritizes the electric drivetrain, but if you push hard on the accelerator pedal, it's going to turn on the gasoline engine as well because it thinks you want all that 370 horsepower. Over here we have the e-save button. That is going to either save the battery for later or enable a charge battery mode. That mode is controlled over here in the infotainment system. We press vehicle, we then choose e-save over here, and then you can choose whether you're going to save the battery or charge the battery and the target charge level. Over here we can also control the charge rate when you're on various different power sources. So you can see even on this 240 volt source, I can adjust the amount of current that the vehicle is pulling. That is a really handy feature if you're in an area where you only have limited power availability, or you deliberately want to just draw less power so that way it doesn't stress your systems quite as much. The other button you need to know about is, oddly enough, located right here above the infotainment system. That is the Max Regen button. This is not quite one pedal driving, but it's pretty close. It's going to enable very aggressive regeneration when the vehicle's going downhill or coming to a stop. After you've slowed down significantly, you are going to need to put your foot on the brake pedal to stay at that stop and, of course, come to a complete stop. I'd describe the 4xe Grand Cherokee as quick, but not necessarily fast. 5.9 seconds is respectable, and it is a little bit quicker than the current generation V8 model, but you will go faster 0 to 60 in a Lincoln Aviator or a BMW X5. The X5 will also give you a tiny bit more electric range. Now, versus the more direct competition, which would be something like the Range Rover or Range Rover Sport with the plug-in hybrid system, this is actually faster with just a little bit less range. So pretty comparable on the range front, but definitely swifter 0 to 60. The extra curb weight of the battery pack is certainly noticeable out on the road. This took 130 feet to stop from 60 miles an hour back to 0. That is certainly on the long side of things, but interestingly, this splits the difference between the X5, which is just a little bit shorter, and the Land Rover Range Rover, which was a little bit longer. To be honest, driving this vehicle, the plug-in hybrid system or the regular Grand Cherokee, I kept thinking of the BMW X5 for the most part while I was driving this. The driving nature is not really that far off. They're both rear-biased, four-wheel drive, all-wheel drive systems, whatever you want to call this type of system. They both have air suspensions in the models that I'm talking about here. They both have pretty comparable ride and handling scores. The X5 has sharper steering and better precision, better feel out on the road, but when it comes to actual grip in the last plug-in hybrid model that I was driving, it's substantially similar to this. As far as drivetrain feel and drivetrain behavior goes, honestly, most of the competition is very similar to this, because the theory of operation in the Lincoln plug-in hybrid, the BMW, and the Range Rover is identical to the theory of operation here. In fact, some of these components are essentially slightly tweaked versions of what we find in the BMW and the Range Rover. They also use ZF 8-speed automatic transmissions and pancake electric motors between the engine and the transmission, and the Range Rover one is also made by ZF. We don't know if it's exactly the same as this electric motor. It appears that the BMW is also very, very similar as far as the motor itself goes. Now, the control systems, the battery systems, etc., those are very different between these three vehicles. And oddly enough, I think that the Jeep has a slight edge here, because this has a faster onboard charger, certainly than the ones that we find in those competitive European models, and slightly smoother programming as far as engagement of the clutch pack versus the Lincoln Aviator and the Land Rover. Now, I do think the BMW X5 is a bit smoother as far as transitions between hybrid and electric-only operation, but the difference is fairly minor. Not all plug-in hybrid systems behave the same. In this vehicle, even in the electric mode, as I said before, you have to control your right foot if you want to stay in electric mode. There's a little indicator over here on the instrument cluster that shows you the power level coming out of the battery, and if you exceed the top end limit of that for too long, even if you're gentle on the pedal, it will turn on the gasoline engine. So you really have to be mindful of that. But I live at 1,300 feet and I have to go up and over a 2,200-foot mountain pass to get to the office, and then of course go from sea level all the way back over that mountain pass to get where I am, and this vehicle will stay in electric-only operation that entire time. Now, on steeper, longer slopes, much like we find in some other plug-in hybrids, if you're really drawing the battery down quickly, it will eventually turn on the gasoline engine just in order to help improve system performance. That's quite logical, because why would you bother stressing out the battery pack in a plug-in hybrid when you have that gasoline engine on board? This is again where the conversation between mitigation and elimination is really important. Some of these decisions are quite logical. I mean, I could floor this for a long time and then really overheat the battery pack, or I could just have the car turn on the gasoline engine and save the battery pack's lifetime, save the battery pack's performance for later. That's part of the reason that battery pack lifetime in plug-in hybrids like this is likely going to be longer than some EVs, and ultimately a bit less important, to be honest, than other EVs. Because if this vehicle gets you 26 miles of all-electric range from the factory, which it definitely did in my testing, then does it really matter if in 10 years it only gets you 22 miles of electric range? You still got electric range, you still don't have to replace the battery pack to get where you're going, because you have that gasoline engine on board. It just means that the amount of time you spend in electric-only operation may change a little bit over time, but likely because of the way this vehicle uses its battery pack, it's actually going to be slower in that change than a full electric vehicle. This vehicle is reserving more of the battery pack for lifetime preservation of the pack, and it uses the pack very differently than an EV. Those are very important things to keep in mind. When it comes to the handling score, I'm going to give the plug-in hybrid version of the Grand Cherokee a B. Keep in mind, the price tag of this vehicle puts it in direct competition to something like an X5 plug-in hybrid. The X5 is going to definitely be more on-road focused. It's sharper in terms of steering feel. General body dynamics are more controlled than we find here in the Grand Cherokee. Now, that shouldn't be too surprising because the Grand Cherokee's mission is quite different. This is not trying to be an on-road focused model like the X5 is. In the grand scheme of crossovers and SUVs, we have vehicles that are solidly 100% on-road focused, vehicles that are solidly off-road focused, like a two-door Wrangler Rubicon, and then everything else sorts in between. But the Grand Cherokee definitely skews towards the off-road mission, with the adaptive air suspension that gives us gobs of ground clearance, well over 10 inches of ground clearance in this model, and more importantly than that, a suspension tune that is designed to soak up the bumps on an off-road trail. If you were going to spend more than 4 or 5 minutes on a rough road, whether that's a gravel road or dirt road or a true off-road trail, I would take this any day over an X5 because it's simply going to be more livable. It's going to be more comfortable. You're not going to feel like you got punched in the kidneys. And even though you could do those kinds of trails in an X5 for hours and hours and hours, the system is more than capable, it's not going to be as comfortable as doing that in a Grand Cherokee. And that's the mission of this vehicle. When it comes to the ride score, I'm going to give this model an A-. If you want a little bit more cushion, you could get the Trailhawk version of the Grand Cherokee that has thicker tires on it, a slightly higher profile tire, and that's going to give you a bit more cushion. But this model still soaks up imperfections pretty well, like this enormous pothole right here that I'm going to deliberately drive over. It handles that really, really nicely, something that we don't find in, say, an X5 or a GLE or the luxury set. And largely, this is pretty similar to the Land Rover and Range Rover competition. In my cabin noise testing at 50 miles an hour, I measured 70 decibels in here. This seems a little bit quieter than the regular Grand Cherokee, likely because of the positioning of the battery pack underneath the vehicle and the fact that, of course, it's an electric-only operation. So there's going to be a little bit more rumble if the gasoline engine turns on, or if you were driving the V8 or the V6 model where the gasoline engine is always going to be on. Over the week and a half that I've had this Grand Cherokee, the fuel economy has surprised me a bit. I talked about the fuel economy calculations, now let's talk about the numbers. 24.8 miles per gallon is what I averaged over about 300 miles of daily driving. That's up and over that 2,200 foot mountain pass, not charging the battery at all. But again, it is worth noting that the fuel economy trip computer thingy right here in the instrument cluster, it was saying I was only averaging about 19 miles per gallon. I did use enough gas to actually determine that the reality was about 25 miles per gallon. Even if there's a bit of variation in the fill, drive, fill method of fuel economy calculation, this fuel economy number was still impressive, and actually a little bit above the EPA score. I actually think that the hilly driving that I generally do on a daily basis is the reason for that, because going down the hill, this was able to regenerate power back into the battery, and at the bottom of the mountain pass, I was able to get about 4 miles of all-electric range back out of the battery. And in a regular hybrid vehicle, the battery would have been full just maybe about a third of the way down the hill, and I wouldn't have had that additional electric-only benefit. The flip side of that is that if you're simply doing steady-state highway travel, there's not going to be much of a fuel economy benefit for the Grand Cherokee. You would actually be better off getting the V6 engine, treating it gently out on the open highway. That will give you the best fuel economy at, say, 70 miles an hour going from one side of the country to the other. But if you're doing stop and go, slow and go, city driving, country driving, etc., you may see a fuel economy benefit even if you cannot plug the Grand Cherokee in. However, of course, you're lugging around that big battery pack. I would love to see Jeep, for instance, give us a regular hybrid version of the Grand Cherokee that was maybe a little bit more focused on simply gasoline fuel economy, but it doesn't seem like that's likely because, of course, this plug-in hybrid's going to get the tax credit. After driving this at home for a week and a half, I'm more impressed with the plug-in hybrid system than I was at the launch event. If you do plan on actually rock crawling with your Grand Cherokee plug-in hybrid, serious off-roading, which it can do, you should know that I'm not a fan of the feel in those situations. The clutch engagement could be a lot smoother. When you're really climbing up those rock surfaces, you need a bit more, you dig deeper into the throttle, or you run out of battery power. The engine engagement is not exactly the smoothest, and because it has just a clutch pack, not a torque converter, in those really low-speed off-road situations where you're going maybe 1/10 of a mile an hour, 1/4 of a mile an hour, etc., you really need the low-range mode in order to enable that clutch lockup to happen at lower speeds. And you're still going to get this kind of herky-jerky thing as the clutch pack is locking up and engaging. I was a little bit worried about that and how that would impact daily driving. In real-world driving, absolutely not a problem because you're just not doing that kind of driving. Even if I put this vehicle into its, say, the e-save mode right here, now it is going to turn on the gasoline engine when I start up, And even though there is still that clutch pack engagement and still the shifting from the 8-speed automatic, this is much smoother than in those off-road situations because you're just not using the system in the same way. So I don't have those same concerns for daily driving in this vehicle. And if you're an occasional off-roader, I think there's still the added benefit to the plug-in hybrid nature of the system that would make it worth it. You would just have to get used to that unusual feel. Now, that clutch pack engagement is likely why the towing capacity of this vehicle is limited versus the V8 version of the Grand Cherokee. I suspect it doesn't have to do with anything else about the Grand Cherokee's design other than from that 0 to whenever that clutch pack can fully lock up, you only have the torque from the electric motor, and that will only get you so far. The 4xe is absolutely my favorite version of the Grand Cherokee. It's as if Jeep designed this specifically for my demographic, which is admittedly a pretty narrow slice of the pie. I live in a forest, I live off-grid, I have the need for the all-wheel drive systems, the off-road ability of the Grand Cherokee in daily life, but I also am interested in reducing my gasoline consumption. And you need to be interested in that to want the 4xe, because this is not going to give you a fuel economy bump like you'll find in a Highlander hybrid or a Lexus RX hybrid if you do not have the ability to plug it in. This will get you better than average fuel economy. On my daily runs, I was averaging about 25 MPG, so definitely punching above the EPA weight. But that is definitely below a lot of the dedicated hybrids out there that will get you over 35 MPG on a similar drive route. If, however, you have the ability to plug it in, you can get some seriously excellent numbers. Again, 120 miles, that is a pretty representative slice of my daily commute over a week. I averaged a consumption of just half a gallon of gasoline. That is a big change from a regular Grand Cherokee. And based on my driving style, that means that I would visit the gas station maybe about once every 2 months or so in a vehicle that has almost 400 horsepower and the off-road capability that you would expect in a Grand Cherokee. To my mind, there are just two problems with the Grand Cherokee. The first one is that we as Americans, and I include myself in this, tend to prefer elimination to mitigation. The Grand Cherokee is about mitigating your gasoline usage, not eliminating it. Here in this country, we tend to prefer stopping smoking or stopping the drinking. We don't want to cut back on the smoking or cut back on the drinking, even though that can have some serious health benefits, just like serious benefits for cutting back on your gasoline usage rather than completely eliminating it. This is going to be a lot easier to integrate into your life if you're worried about the where do I charge, how far can I go, etc. Get a plug-in hybrid like this, see if you can adapt to an electric lifestyle, and next time, if you don't want one, just don't get another one. Or if you don't ever have the ability to plug it in, as it turns out, then no harm, no foul. You've still improved your fuel economy just a smidgen, and you've gotten a federal tax credit out of it as well. We should talk about that. This is one of the few vehicles that is going to qualify for the federal tax credit. It is under the price cap, so it's under $80,000. That's going to start next year. If your income is under that cap, then you could get a $7,500 tax credit on the Grand Cherokee, assuming all the stars continue to align. Then there's the price tag. It's just under $58,000 starting. Now, because it does have that $7,500 tax credit, something that is not going to return for a decent number of plug-in hybrids and EVs, that could effectively drop the price down to just over $50,000. Still a pretty steep asking price, and it is logical then that the plug-in hybrid system is available only on the upper end trims of Grand Cherokee. Because of the Grand Cherokee's odd dual mission, where it competes with entries like the Explorer and the Highlander in low trims, and then entries like the BMW X5 or Mercedes-Benz GLE or Land Rover lineup in the upper end trims, you need to keep in mind this 4xe plug-in hybrid system, it's not meant to compete with Highlander or Explorer. This is meant to compete with the Aviator plug-in hybrid, the X5 plug-in hybrid, perhaps the Volvo XC90 plug-in hybrid, and other plug-in hybrids in that luxury segment, like the ones that we find from Land Rover. This has a pretty different mission when it comes to off-roading ability, on-road driving dynamics, the power output from the plug-in hybrid system, etc. Very different mission than we find in mainstream plug-in hybrids. In this lower end segment, you might look at something like a Sorento plug-in hybrid. It's going to be a lot less expensive than this. If you simply want a mid-sized thing with a plug, go there, go to some of the other less expensive options. If you're looking for a more luxury-oriented vehicle with off-road capability and towing capability and a plug, That's what the Grand Cherokee is for. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section. And if you want to know exactly how this stacks up against its key competition, be sure and stay tuned for the Auto Buyer's Guide episode that's coming out a little bit later. And in that episode, I'm going to take a deep dive into pricing, the options, the trim levels, and how exactly they stack up against the European competition. See all of you later.